17. From the start, they went into battle. Every morning promptly at 7 a.m., the newly assembled task force met for a daily briefing in the conference room in police headquarters. Even the FBI agents who had set up their own base in a blue trailer parked in the headquarters parking lot came. The conference room was big, filled with rows of polished blonde wood tables sitting on a gray-patterned carpet. Ceiling lights kept things very bright, and there was a band of small rectangular windows running in a row near the top of a side wall that let in light, too. Everything looked brand new, almost corporate, as if a mid-level insurance company had just moved in. But there was a murder board adjacent to a far wall with rows of gruesome homicide photos, and everyone in the room had a gun. Standing at the front room leading the briefings each morning, taking charge, was a young Moscow police corporal, Brett Payne. The wolf had gotten away. It was spring break 2010, and Brett Payne, a 20-year-old University of Idaho student, had been determined to bag the big gray wolf that had been seen roaming up on Lindstrom Peak deep in the high timber of northern Idaho's St. Joe National Forest. After 4 days, Payne hadn't found a single paw print. When Payne broke camp that morning, he considered giving up, but the prospect of leaving the mountain empty-handed just didn't feel right. So he kept at it. And about 4 p.m., the sun still high in the sky, he spotted tracks. He followed them for the next 2 hours. And there it was, a big male wolf lying across a draw in the middle of the road, about 300 yards in the distance. Carefully, with the utmost quiet, Payne lowered himself to the forest floor. He could see the animal clearly through his rifle scope. If the wolf caught a human scent, he'd bolt. But the wind was in Payne's favor. He put his finger on the rifle's trigger, started to apply pressure, yet still hesitated. It was intense, he later explained. He needed to calm down. But suddenly the wolf raised his head, so Payne shot. The bullet went through the animal's chest, dropping it at once. Payne had bagged his wolf. It was now 12 years later, and Payne was once again the relentless hunter. Only now he was on the trail of a different sort of predator. A mass murderer. Payne had come to the Moscow PD just 2 years earlier, after serving in the no-nonsense 82nd Airborne in Afghanistan. He had been in some very difficult situations. Touch and go was all he'd say to anyone who asked, refusing to give details. Then he'd done a stint stateside in the MPs, and that too required that a soldier knew how to handle himself. Chief Fry had taken an instant liking to his confident, squared-away military demeanor, and promoted him quickly to corporal over other, more experienced officers. When the state police had asked who'd be leading the morning briefings, Fry, without thinking too much about it, chose Payne. The chief knew that Payne, although new to the force, had been involved in several complex forensic investigations with the MPs. That sort of technical expertise, the chief suspected, could come in handy. And Fry had heard the story about the wolf. The chief, an old elk hunter himself, had come to appreciate that tenacity was half the battle, maybe more in any hunt. In those first tentative days, it was the task force's operating conviction that there had to be a logic to the crime, and through meticulous probing it would be revealed. Once they understood why the murders had happened, then the path to identifying the killer would be made clear. And so the base from which they launched their attack was two-pronged. They divided their inquiries into the empirical and the theoretical. The empirical side of the ledger listed the facts. Fact: the 4 students were killed in their sleep, sometime between 3 and 5 a.m. In the weeks ahead, they'd develop a more precise timeline. The murders, the authorities deduced, occurred between around 4 and 4:20 in the morning. Fact: there was no sign of forced entry, or of robbery, or of sexual assault. Fact: there was no trail of blood outside the house. Fact: the King Road residence, a well-visited party house in the months before the murders, was a repository for a large collection of forensic evidence: blood, saliva, hair, fingerprints, DNA. Within 2 weeks of the murders, the investigators had, they announced, collected 103 pieces of individual evidence, cataloged approximately 4,000 photographs of the crime scene, and conducted multiple 3D scans of the house. Yet a more disturbing truth, and one they worked to suppress, was that so far they had nothing substantive to show for all this effort. Fact: it had been determined that a single weapon had been used. a long-bladed knife. And a corollary to that was a substantial secret the investigators were not yet ready to reveal. In the third-floor bedroom, tangled in the sheets next to Maddie's sprawled body, they had found a knife sheath with a button snap. It was tan leather, stamped with the brand name K-Bar, and below that USMC and the Marine Corps Eagle, Globe, and Anchor insignia. It was a widely available weapon, sold online and in sporting goods stores, and used by sportsmen, hunters, the military, and apparently, the killer. Fact. And this, too, was another item they were deliberately keeping locked away. They had an eyewitness. Dylan Mortensen had seen the murderer. And even more promising, she'd been able to give a broad yet nevertheless cogent description of the masked black-clad intruder, down to his bushy eyebrows. However, this quite possibly crucial eyewitness came with a lot of baggage that the team conceded among themselves left them dumbfounded. She had, alerted by the early morning suspicious noise, poked her head out of her second-floor bedroom 3 separate times as her roommates were being hacked to death. She had seen a masked intruder, stared at him, frozen and in shock, immobile, never uttering a word or a scream before closing the door to her bedroom and retreating to the safety of her bed. And yet during the course of that long, terrible night, she had never once picked up her cell phone to call 911. A further troubling mystery. She had waited until around 11 that morning, 7 endless hours, before telling anyone that things were amiss. Then, bewilderingly, she reached out with a vague call of alarm to friends, summoning them to the house. It was one of Ethan's golfing buddies, Hunter Johnson, who just moments after taking one quick look inside the house, grabbed Dylan's cell phone and his voice a shriek called 911. The investigators did not know what to make of Dylan's behavior. Shock can send people careening down strange paths, they realized. But the enormity of her disconnection, her long hours of passivity, threw them for a loop. Then, after having grappled with the facts, the team each morning would turn to the still theoretical aspects of the investigation. And here the search for truth was more tenuous. The best they could come up with were hypotheses, and those, as any veteran detective knew, were a dime a dozen, and still you'd be overpaying. Yet since the crime made no sense, how could they in good faith rule out any theory, no matter how seemingly preposterous? Finally, at the end of each of the morning sessions and the opening days of the hunt, the team would take a long, hard look at what remained unknown. They couldn't figure out how the killer had gotten away without apparently leaving a clue. They had no idea where the murder weapon might be, and they had not the slightest understanding of why he had chosen these victims. It was Arthur Conan Doyle back in 1887 who first introduced the role of a consulting detective. Here in London, Doyle's masterful hero Sherlock Holmes boasted, we have lots of government detectives and lots of private ones. When the fellows are at fault, they come to me, and I manage to put them on the right scent. And as the investigation in Moscow plodded on and frustratingly on without significant result, Chief Fry decided that what had worked for Sherlock Holmes could work for him too. He called out for help, appealing to locals to become, in effect, consulting detectives. He wanted help to put his men on the right scent. Detectives are looking for context to the events and people involved in these murders, a Moscow PD press release announced. To assist with the ongoing investigation, any odd or out-of-the-ordinary events that took place should be reported. The notice urged, your information, whether you believe it significant or not, might be the piece of the puzzle that helps investigators solve these murders. And so the tips poured in. It was, after all, never easier to be a sleuth. A new generation of consulting detectives armed with cell phones and laptops with ready access to a vast repository of information about the victims, from selfies and Instagram and Facebook posts, embraced the opportunity. It wouldn't be long before more than 20,000 tips were received. That catalog of suspicions included more than 9,025 emails, 4,575 phone calls to the hotline, and 6,050 digital media submissions. An army of law enforcement analysts was assigned to sift through the collection. It was the back-bearing of all time, and much of it led down rabbit holes of fatuous speculation. Some of the clues were not just wrong-headed, but cruel. Innocent ex-boyfriends, the hoodie-wearing bystander at the late-night food truck, a garrulous King Road neighbor who insisted on sharing rambling, half-baked anecdotes with every reporter who knocked on his door, and frat brothers who were rumored to be stoked up on steroids and driven by long gestating grievances. All were persistently slandered with a malicious authority. It got so crazy that a history prof at the university decided that she had to sue to put an end to one internet sleuth's bizarre speculation. It had come to her in a psychic vision that a failed romance with one of the female victims had driven the teacher to kill. Yet in the end, all the shaking of the trees had amounted to nothing, and Fry now realized he had to retreat from his earlier professed certitude. At a press conference, the chief quietly conceded that he could not confirm there was no ongoing threat to the community. Residents should, he said with a defeated resignation, remain vigilant.